From the lab to your ears, you're listening to WonderLabs.
Hi everyone, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson checking in from the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, OIST, in the middle of a forest, on an island, somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean. In this episode, I speak with Rob Campbell. Rob is one of those delightful people who can't be put in a box, and we actually had a lot of back and forth when trying to decide on how to structure this conversation. Structure being the operative word. Rob describes himself broadly as someone who thinks about structure. He investigates the biological assembly of materials, with the goal of improving our understanding in both material science and evolutionary biology, ultimately leading to better bioinspired materials engineering. He currently works on spider silk glands and the assembly of silk materials. And in this conversation, we talk about spider silk, its many forms and functions, and how humans are using this natural material in bioinspired design. We then take a look at biomimicry and the inspired part of bioinspired design, moving away from the limits of nature to create more interesting results with human ingenuity. Oh, and we also talk about zombie ants. I've always found them fascinating and figured it would be a waste to have someone who studied them in detail in front of a microphone and not ask them about it. Like Rob's skills and experience, this conversation is an eclectic and wide-ranging one. I'll apologize in advance for the misleading title. You won't walk away from this knowing how to become a Spider-Man, but maybe knowing loads about silk and structure is another kind of superpower. Rob Campbell, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a bit about spider silk.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I feel like I should start with is a lot of times when I tell people I work with spiders, they're always like, oh, that sounds like so terrifying. And if you had asked me like 3 years ago if I was excited about spiders and wanted to work with them, I would have been like, no, I will never research spiders, but maybe some other things. But spiders are really cool because all of them produce some amount of silk material, and this material has lots of different properties depending on the function and different species, and it uses a very environmentally friendly fabrication process compared to the way that human beings usually think about materials.
So there are many different types of silk. And
yes.
Many different functions.
Yeah.
Maybe you could walk us through what some of those are.
So when I started working with silk, I also thought there was maybe just one type of silk that spiders make. And a lot of people who I talk to who even work on spider silk think of silk materials as just this one thing. But if you look at a spider that builds a web, it usually is made up of maybe 6 to 8 different types of silk materials. Each of them are produced in a different gland inside the spider body.
Within a single species of spider?
Yes, within a single individual in a single species, they have usually 6 to 8 different types of silk glands, all producing different materials. Some are really strong, some are really flexible, some are really sticky, some are more liquid than solid, and there's just this huge diversity within individuals in addition to across species.
And it's really quite integral to allowing them to survive and replicate.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that makes spider silk such an interesting biological material system, is that it is very directly related to survival and reproduction of spiders. So spiders use silk to build webs. They also use it to build egg cases for protecting eggs during development. All these things that if there's a single mistake in the fabrication process, then they basically are just going to die and not continue to exist. So there's a lot of evolutionary pressure to make sure that this system is as optimized as possible and also very diverse and flexible. So if you think of a spider web, you think of the kind of classic Halloween decoration, sort of circular orb web is what people call it. And so it has these spokes going out from the center, which are very structural, which is one type of silk. And then it has a spiral going around it, which is a slightly less tough, more flexible type of silk. And then there's another kind of sticky type of silk that also is in a spiral. And there are 2 types of sticky silk. One that is a lot more energetically costly to produce, which uses nanofibers to trap things, which I think is really interesting. And then one that is also interesting, but is a lot more common and uses more of just a glue on that. And so the spiders who make the gluey capture silk, they consume and rebuild their web every day. But the spiders that build the even more costly, structurally complex sticky silk, they will kind of keep their web for as long as possible and try to get as much use out of it as they can.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And it's not just the spiders that are using the silk. It's been used by humans for a number of things.
Yeah. A lot of times people talk about anecdotes from history of people using spider silk for wound closure. If you get hurt, you can maybe like grab some spider silk and put it on there, and it will help you heal in that context.
Yeah, I came across that example.
Yeah.
Peasants in the Carpathian Mountains using a local purse web spider silk for its antiseptic properties and potentially vitamin K that has anti-blood clotting properties, which is kind of cool. I don't know if that is just anecdotal, but...
Well, I know that when you get into the world of silk research, there's a lot of back and forth between spider silk and silkworm silk and other types of silk, since lots of organisms that make silk-like materials. But spider silk is difficult to work with as a pure material because it's hard to get a lot of it. Spiders... They're very difficult to farm because if you put a bunch of them together, they tend to cannibalize each other, and it's not really the best way to get a lot of material.
It's not pretty either.
Yeah, no. Well, depending on how emotionally attached you are to the spider, I think if you can distance yourself, it has a sort of like cycle of life kind of thing to it that can be sort of beautiful. But
would you say that you are able to emotionally detach yourself from the spiders that you work with?
Yeah, I guess so. But I'm lucky because most of the spiders I work with start out dead or I have to kill them quite early, so I never get to develop a lot of an attachment.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, I was saying there's a lot of work that looks at both, and I know for both spider silk and silkworm silk, the fact that it is this protein material, so silk is made of structural proteins, and that means that it's very biocompatible. It's just sort of eventually dissolves into the body and gets broken down, as opposed to a lot of other plastics which would be rejected. So that's also part of the use in wound healing and things like that, is that it forms a scaffold that then cells can grow across and consume and use for healing.
So that biocompatibility then is one of the things that makes artificial spinning and synthetic spider silk so attractive. So moving away from the realm of naturally occurring compounds, what does that space look like?
So I spent some time working with people who are, I think, kind of the founders of some of the current silk material technology sort of thing. And it's really cool, but most of it is very different from fiber spinning. So they take silk fibers and you can break them down into the proteins and to just get like a liquid protein, and then use it to reassemble different types of material structures. And so there people make other types of scaffolds or screws or other things that can be implanted into the body, potentially sensors, which is really exciting. And that's a space where mostly people work with silkworm silk because you need a large quantity of material to be able to kind of constantly produce all of these systems. And you get a lot of silk from a single silkworm, and you can have a lot of silkworms in one place. So it's mostly just that silkworms don't cannibalize each other. But on the other hand, the proteins are a little bit different. And in silk fibers, silkworm silk is not as tough and strong as the strongest spider silks. So if we want to have other properties alongside the biocompatibility, if we want to have something that maybe can be more flexible or strong or something within the body, then it would be cool to understand how to use other types of proteins for that as well.
Those are actually some quite pragmatic uses and a lot of medical applications there too. Becoming SpiderMan.
Yeah. So I feel like that to me is one of the more interesting questions, because obviously like biomedical applications are really important and really exciting, and there's a lot of cool work going on there. But I got interested in this field mostly just because I'm interested in the structure of materials.
Mostly because I wanted to become Spider-Man.
Right. Also that, honestly. And I think weirdly, Spider-Man is a really great way to think about the different types of silk that you can have, because he uses lots of different silk materials that he makes, usually not from his body, but from some lab. He kind of has discovered how to do this amazing technology, and then he can use it to capture all sorts of people or do all sorts of different applications. And that's something that we can't do right now with spider silk, because we understand that the proteins are important, but we don't really know how to assemble them into really complex structures with all that sort of diverse application. I think there are like 3 companies that are really pushing artificial spider silk, and they can do a lot of cool things. But most of them, from what I've seen and talked to other people in the field about, they can't really make actual fibers, and they just can make fiber-like materials. So a lot of their spider silk fibers use other fabrics or things kind of integrated to give it that sort of structure. Whereas if you really wanted to be SpiderMan and sort of shoot sticky fibers at something to capture people or use it to conduct electricity or all sorts of stuff, you want to have some of those things use other materials, but you still need a structured protein assembly process in the base.
So I'm an artificial silk spinner. What exact properties might I be interested in?
One of the things that people talk a lot about when you think about spider silk is that it's super tough, and if you could scale it up to a much larger size and you had a giant web, then you could stop an airplane with just these really thin threads. Or people talk about things like that. And I guess also in SpiderMan, he uses his silk to sort of pull boats back together after they've been broken apart, or stop really heavy, fast-moving objects. And
can't put Mary Jane back together, though.
Right. Well, maybe with the biomedical application, but that maybe is a different property. And I think, so there are a lot of different things that you can do. And so most of the research that's been around has looked at the protein composition, and there's a lot of chemistry involved in how these proteins assemble into different structures to be strong or flexible, and also to kind of scale up from the nanoscale to the macro scale. And if we want to continue to scale past that, I am really interested in the physics of that process, which I think is something that we're still kind of missing, and thinking about how do these proteins then stack together, because they do eventually kind of stack into this hierarchical layers of tiny fibers into larger fibers into larger fibers, all in bundles and bundles and bundles. And that's one of the things that I think is kind of missing that's really interesting to look forward.
Moving beyond spiders, maybe you can talk us through biomimicry.
Yeah. So personally, I'm really into big picture concepts. So I kind of came into spider silk from a broader interest in biomimicry. And I think that biomimicry is really kind of an interesting and difficult field because it is something that's always been part of engineering and science. People look at nature and are like, oh, maybe we can do that. And now there's a lot particularly in materials, where we can look at different scales and look at the nanoscale and the microscale and the macro scale to mimic these structures. But it's still difficult to do very rigorously. And I think that there's a lot of potential in the field, but it's still sort of, I don't know, I feel like when I talk to some people who aren't working in this area, they're like, oh, I don't know, yeah, that's a fun thing to say for public outreach, but is it really useful for actually research we're doing? And I would argue that it is, if you can find the way to integrate it. And one of the things I think is really exciting about the future of biomimicry is trying to connect the engineering and the biology a lot more directly. And so we talked about how spiders produce lots of different silk materials kind of for different functions in their own life cycle. And we're interested in making silk with lots of different functions to be SpiderMan or heal people or whatever. And those are different functions, but they might follow similar processes. And I think if we can understand more about spider evolution, we can also understand more about spider materials.
What examples do we have then of biomimicry currently being used that might be tangentially related to your interest in spider silk?
I think it's interesting because there are lots of different things that are biomimicry, that some are super complicated and some are maybe not. So the first thing I think of that I sometimes talk to people about is that Velcro is biomimicry. It's a structural material based on thistle or other kind of sticky seed pods that latch onto things, and we use it all the time. And it just kind of has that it's based on looking at biology and figuring out what can we understand structurally from that to apply to our own needs. Then there's also, within biomedical technology, there's a lot of biomimicry, thinking about if we want to think about biocompatibility, or what function do different parts of the body have, and can we replicate some of that to make treatments more effective or to heal wounds more effectively. But then there's also a lot of other new, maybe a little bit less developed kind of biomimicry things, like invisibility is something that people look at a lot for biomimicry. And you think about it, invisibility, it sounds super crazy, but then also there are a lot of animals that have a lot of camouflage to blend into things. There are a lot of animals that are transparent, that achieve this sort of invisibility structurally. And that's something that we can learn from outside of physical tough materials, which is kind of cool.
So people are actually working on invisibility right now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little extreme to say that they're working on invisibility, I guess, but also not. It depends. There are people working on it from both sides. But I know some people who study transparent shrimp and transparent jellyfish and things, and kind of be like, how is it that they're able to be invisible in water, and what is going on there with those like light manipulation properties. Also, actually, one of the things I first got interested in about biomimicry is I was looking at manipulation of light for solar panels, and how can you direct light directly into a solar panel more effectively to get as much energy out of that as possible. And there are a lot of structures in nature that manipulate light for color or invisibility, or to absorb light or reflect light. And so that's something that's pretty cool.
It seems to make intuitive sense that if nature has been able to achieve something through this very long-running evolutionary process, that we might be able to learn a thing or two. On the flip side, things like aviation have been completed in absolute defiance of what nature would suggest is correct. So what do you think about the limitations of bioinspired technologies?
One of the really interesting things that I encounter a lot talking to engineers and biologists, and kind of going back and forth, is that in engineering and like human design systems, we're always looking to optimize something. We want to get something that's the strongest. We want to get something that's the most flexible, or can do something to the extreme. And nature is not super good at optimizing anything, because it just has to be good enough for you to survive. And so I think there are certain applications where then biomimicry is maybe less useful, but we also are entering a kind of, to me, like a design space where we're juggling a lot of different factors. And that's something that biology and natural systems do really well. They don't have one thing that they're the best at. They have maybe like 50 things that they're very good at. And that allows them to adapt and sort of change. And that's why you get self-healing materials or other sorts of things that we can't quite create on our own, because it's not the way we usually think about engineering systems. And so that's one of the like core questions I had when I started looking at spider silk, is people say, oh, spider silk is so tough. This one type of silk that spiders hang from, the dragline silk, is like the toughest material. How does it get to be so tough? And I feel like if you think about it from biology, is the toughness really the thing that it needed the most? Or is it a combination of other factors where it maybe uses this material for other functions as well, and the toughness is a byproduct that happens to be useful? There's kind of different ways of approaching design and fabrication from that perspective. Is like one goal, or just you happen to discover something as you go along.
Well, I guess if species have persisted for so long and the process of good enough has persisted for so long, maybe good enough is the optimal approach.
Yeah. On the other hand, the good enough applications that species have are not necessarily the ones that we want, which is something that people are really excited about with like biomedical applications or sensing. Like silk does not send radio waves, but you could add it to other systems to make a sensor that can then send a signal to something outside of the body. And that's a kind of uniquely engineering, human-focused application that nature would never have to develop. And so if we stick too closely, we'll never develop that either. I like to focus on the sort of inspired side of bioinspired design and biomimicry, that I feel like we can learn a lot from it, and maybe you end up taking lessons and inspiration from it more than really replicating it. But I think there's a lot to be learned there, which is fun.
Something else that's very fun. I know you've also spent some time thinking about and working on the so-called zombie ants.
Yeah, so I guess it is a very different topic, but it is kind of weirdly linked to some of the other stuff that I've done. So a lot of the work I do with spider silk uses X-ray imaging to look at inside of spiders, look at the glands, look at the structure, try and see what's going on there. And zombie ants are another thing that people have seen and known about for a long time, but don't know a lot about what happens inside. So in ants and other insects, there are a whole bunch of usually other organisms that parasitize these species, and they can change the behavior of the ant and get it to do something to benefit the parasite, often ending in the ant's untimely death. So there are fungi, funguses that do this. There are other types of really small like nematodes or microorganisms. And there are also flies that do this. And flies, wasps, fungus are kind of the three main types of parasites that infect ants, and they'll change the behavior to either stay inside and to a certain point and then leave the nest to kind of safely kill the ant and not be killed by the ant's friends, who are then upset that they've killed the one ant, or maybe to go get eaten by another organism that it can then continue the life cycle inside that body, or just go to a point. In fungus, a lot of them go up high into the trees to get access to sunlight or other things to sort of collect food through other mutualisms and things like that. If I could have chosen any system, I probably would have chosen to work on the fungus because I think that's like the coolest, craziest one. My work was mostly on fly parasites, and they do this thing where they're very specialized, and the female fly will just kind of attack an ant that she finds out foraging with this kind of appendage she has that's like a can opener that just like stabs through the exoskeleton and
Jesus
lays an
Christ.
egg inside the ant's body. And then she flies away, and the ant is kind of like, oh, that was crazy. But I guess I'll go about my life. And then the egg eventually develops into a larva that travels to the head and slowly consumes muscle in the head, because unlike humans, which most of our head is brain, most of an ant's head is muscle, because they have these huge mandibles that they use to collect food and do other things. So they need a lot of muscle to control them. And so the larva will eat the muscle and kind of wrap itself around the brain and somehow change the behavior of the ant to just sort of chill out, not raise any attention, not get eaten. And then when it's ready, it leaves the nest and goes somewhere kind of far away and eats the brain, and the head falls off. And then it has a nice protective shell in which to develop into an adult fly. And perhaps the best part is then that it, of course, crawls out of the mouth of the decapitated ant and flies away to continue attacking other ants in the future.
That is one of the grimmest things I've ever heard.
So these are called phorid flies, Phorid. And if you do some Google searching, you can find some really cool images of them.
Nice. And of course, tying this back to biomimicry, there's obviously a lot of inspiration that we can draw from.
Yeah. So I had some really, this is always fun to talk about because people are always really excited about this system because it's just so crazy. And I've had some cool conversations with engineers about like, oh, what could we learn from this? Like, how does the larva find different tissue inside the ant? How does it send signals to the ant? How does it interact with all these things? Is there chemical, physical, other types of interactions going on? And what can we kind of learn from that? Which I think is maybe challenging because these are very small systems, but also pretty exciting. And the other thing that's really interesting is now a lot of biology is using a lot more X-ray technology that's developed relatively recently. And so it allows us to ask questions about parasitization and taxonomy and anatomy that were very difficult before because ants are tiny and you can look at them under a microscope, but it's not the same as having a three-dimensional X-ray image of what's going on inside. And this also allows us to look at finer details of anatomical structure and think about what materials are going on inside these organisms and how do they contribute to different functions, both in parasitization and just in normal ants that are not zombies and going to unfortunately have an untimely end.
We usually wrap up with a quick fire round.
Okay.
Can you explain in a couple of sentences your area of research interest?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I usually now describe it in the context of structure. So I'm really interested in material structure, and I'm interested in the structure around the development of materials, so evolution or engineering.
I'm interested in becoming SpiderMan.
Yes.
Which emerging field in science and tech are you most excited about?
I am most excited about the work that I see in between academic science and design and architecture. I think that there's a lot of really cool things that mostly around structure. So I'm a little bit biased, but I just think that's one of the most interesting spaces.
If you could wave a magic wand and erase a common misconception from everybody's collective memories relating to your field, what would that be?
I think it would be that there's only one type of silk and that all silk are the same.
Is there a tool that you are particularly fond of in using in your research?
I really enjoy electron microscopy. I haven't gotten to do that much of it, but I just think it's a really cool technique and you get some really beautiful images, which is also always a plus.
Do you have a science-related fact or joke for us?
So I'm really interested in micro and nanoscale structure, and there's a lot of stuff to do with light around that. But apparently, part of why the moon is so bright in the sky is because of the microstructure of the sand and soil on it and the way that it interacts with light that gets reflected off of it.
Rob Campbell, where can people go to find out more about you?
You can find me on Twitter at Rob10C, ROB10C, or you can find me on my website, which is rob10campbell.wix.com/research. And feel free to send me questions. I'm happy to chat.
Rob Campbell, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. This is your host, Chris Richardson. Our brand was designed by Lloyd Preston Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. You can find more music from For The Record at soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.